Hi, I'm Melanie Sill. I'm the Interim Executive Director of the NC Local News Workshop at Elon University. And we're here to talk about a project we call the NC Media Equity Project. And it involves 6 news organizations in North Carolina: ABC 11, PBS North Carolina, WFAE Public Media, the News and Observer and Charlotte Observer, and Education NC. And last summer, as we were all beginning to come to terms with what we needed to do in our organizations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, the NC Local News Workshop reached out to these organizations and others. And we learned that leadership in these organizations were very much immersed in how to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in their organizations and for their audiences. So our idea was to bring them together as a learning group and to elevate the conversation in North Carolina media about how we make progress. So with me today, I'm going to introduce Rochelle Ford, who is the Dean of the School of Communications at Elon University, and Judon Marshall, who is the Executive Vice President and Chief Content Officer for WFAE Public Media serving the Charlotte region. When we all got together the first time, one thing we noted is that there's no lack of good intentions, and people always have the right intentions setting out, but it takes a lot to get change to happen. So Dean Ford, I wonder if you could help people understand specifically what is an example of one thing that the workshop has done to advance this conversation with the group.
Absolutely. So we gather monthly to talk about issues from audience to content to recruitment and retention strategies. But we also have a coach that works individually with each of the newsrooms to challenge them and help them to advance their own plans. So one of the things that was a collective project and a challenge to each of these organizations was, how are we communicating this commitment? How will people know that each of these 6 organizations are committed to enhancing the diversity and making sure their workforce feels included in their organizations? How can they show their commitment to their audiences and understanding their audiences' needs better and creating stories that really fill that gap? So we had one of the students at Elon University do a content analysis of their web presence and to see how far down into their websites would we find their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what they were doing, what their commitment was, and what were going to be some of those action steps that they would do from an internal perspective, as well as to the content and how they're trying to partner with their local communities. And we took that study and we presented it to the news organizations, and some of them looked at it and said, oh my goodness, I wasn't even aware that we weren't telling our story. And they have begun to make proactive steps to tell their own story about what their commitment is and what their actions are. So that's one example of how we provided news and information, specific information about these news organizations, presented it to them. Then they challenged each other to begin to make change, and it's happening now.
Great. Well, one last question for Judon. So how does the work of the Media Equity Project connect to some of the initiatives in your own news organization? How do you link those up?
Well, we've really been focused on diversity training as well as audience building. And I will just use a recent example. When we recently got together with the equity workshop, we invited several more members of our team to participate in that conversation, and in which we heard from leaders of ethnically focused publications about how they serve their audiences and what they think the demand is for mainstream media, right? And what approaches they should take in serving communities of color. And I just polled our newsroom afterwards, the people who participated, and they walked away with that with so many more insights. And, and that's really important, because this is something that we talk about all the time internally, right? But there's still ability for us to learn from others. And that's the real value of the workshop, that we are coming together. And by coming together, we're learning, and it's going to make us even better than we would be if we were going this alone.